The Russian military is adapting to lessons learned in Ukraine. It's usually the failures that make headlines, which I think gives off the impression that Russian forces as a whole don't have the ability to learn from their experiences. And while I agree that most of us likely overestimated the Russian military before this war, we have to be careful not to swing too far in the other direction and write them off entirely as an ineffectual force. Jack Watling and Nick Reynolds of the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, put together a great assessment recently talking about how Russia has and has not adjusted tactics as we move into the second year of this war. Now, RUSI is a British think tank focused on defense and strategy research and has put together some great and free reports on the conflict so far. So I'm going to provide a quick summary of what I think are some of the most interesting highlights here, but of course, if interested in reading the full article, it's linked in the description below. Now, to set this up a little bit, RUSI was pretty upfront in saying that this is exclusively focused on Russian forces because they didn't want to give away any operationally sensitive data on changes within the Ukrainian military. Then they gathered this information from interviews and observations in Ukraine, having met with soldiers and officers from across 10 different brigades. And that group included individuals that have fought in just about every major engagement so far in this war. The report starts by saying, quote, "The tendency in much of the international discourse surrounding the Russian military has been to write it off as tactically inept, technically deficient, and morally broken. These criticisms have more than a grain of truth to them. Nevertheless, they tend to extrapolate from the performances of certain Russian units to the whole force. Alongside these deficiencies, Russian forces have demonstrated that much of their equipment is effective, highly lethal, and adaptable to a range of threats. While there are some serious deficiencies in Russian capabilities, these are most pronounced in conducting offensive operations. Conversely, many of Russia's combat support arms have not only demonstrated reasonable proficiency, but have also shown that they are able to adapt to emerging threats." End quote. This is the general theme that we'll see pop up again and again throughout this assessment, and I'm sure anyone who's followed the war understands really what they're getting at here. How many times have you seen a single clip from one side or the other, and then that's used as evidence to support a broader theory about the entirety of the force? And to be fair, I've probably done the same. It's a pretty easy trap to fall into. The report focuses on 8 portions of the Russian military that I'll add as chapters to this video. Those are armor, infantry, field artillery, engineers, electronic warfare, air defense, aviation, and command and control. RUSI says that Russia has come to rely on 4 types of infantry: disposable, line, assault, and specialized. Now, this is something that's come about during the war, so it's not reflected in any formalized Russian doctrine. Line units are generally used to man static defensive positions. Assault units have received additional training and are better equipped for the offensive type mission set. Russian airborne, VDV, or naval infantry generally fall into this category. And then specialized are those trained as snipers, artillery observers, or experts in any other type of heavy weapon system. The disposable units, probably the most interesting one here, are roughly fire team size, think 3 to 5 men each, and they move out from the Russian front lines in a deliberate movement to contact. These groups are often made up of conscripts from Donetsk and Luhansk, prisoners recruited by Wagner, and undertrained, mobilized Russian civilians. I think this is what's often mischaracterized as human wave assaults, although there is some truth to that. There are regularly multiple of these disposable groups sent out at any given point, and Ukrainian soldiers have reported that they often keep pushing forward after being wounded and, at times, have come under fire from their own side if they start to fall back. Now, the purpose of these disposable units is to force Ukraine to continuously have to defend multiple positions, use up ammo, give away the location of their defenses, and exhaust their personnel who are in a constant fight. In effect, it's a form of reconnaissance aimed to find weak points in the Ukrainian lines. If a weak point is found, the disposable troops are often ordered to dig in and form a base of support, while company-sized elements of assault infantry are moved forward to conduct the attack. Then, if those are successful, line infantry are moved forward into the new position to take up the defense. I'd be interested to learn just how strict those breakdowns are within the Russian forces. Considering that it's not noted in doctrine and is evolving as the war goes on, I'm sure there's some variation from unit to unit, but what the authors gathered from their sources was that this type of system has been on display at multiple areas for quite a while now. Moving over to armor, how Russia has adapted to tank warfare in Ukraine. The report says, quote, "The BTG, or Battalion Tactical Group, concept included the use of armor in company groups to punch into operational depths. Now, tanks are very rarely used in this way. With the destruction of a Russian naval infantry brigade in Volodar attempting such an armored thrust, reinforcing Russia's caution in using such tactics under current conditions, end quote. Current conditions is a reference to the number of minefields, the volume of anti-tank guided missiles, and drones that continue to see pretty heavy use all across the front. RUSI says that tanks are now being used in 3 ways. The first is to supplement artillery through indirect fire engagements. This is most prevalent in areas away from the heavy fighting where Russian artillery and ammunition may not be in as high of supply as elsewhere. It's noted that while this isn't very effective, it is still something that can attempt to fill that gap in artillery fires. Second is the tank's use as a standoff direct fire engagement platform. So think of these as gun positions dug in along the front where you might traditionally see anti-tank guided missiles, anti-tank guns, or heavy machine guns. So it ranges out past 2 kilometers. A tank in that role is able to effectively engage quite a few targets that may otherwise go untouched. And the third use are tank raids, rushing towards enemy positions, usually at night, and firing as many rounds as possible towards their location before turning and heading back. Now, this is supposedly most often done when Russia identifies a Ukrainian troop rotation taking place and uses these quick raids as a way to inflict casualties on a force in transition, or at the very least, disrupt that process. RUSI also noted that Russia is making quite a few changes to the protective posture of their tanks. Of note, they've added a sort of anti-thermal material to the tanks and then fire mostly at dawn or dusk when the vehicle temperature is closer to the ambient temperature of the surroundings. This doesn't completely eliminate the threat of anti-tank guided missiles, but it does make it much harder to target these tanks with many of the systems currently being used by Ukraine. Additionally, RUSI notes that Russian explosive reactive armor, or ERA, has proven pretty effective, with some Ukrainian operators saying they've seen tanks take multiple hits by ATGMs without being knocked out. There was a note on the use of tanks in the urban environment, something that's decreased pretty significantly. I mean, think of all the images and videos that came out of Bakhmut. Very few of those showed tanks over months of pretty intense fighting. Now, RUSI says that tanks haven't been completely written off in the urban fight, but that Russia's transition to using older tanks for that direct fire assault gun type support. Now to the king of battle, artillery. To nobody's surprise, RUSI notes that artillery is still the heart of the Russian military, and they added some pretty interesting statistics about ammunition consumption, which they say has directly affected Russian employment. The report states, quote, "The rate of Russian fire during the first quarter of 2023 fluctuated between 12,000 and 38,000 rounds per day. There's also been a shift in the calibers being most widely utilized, with a relative reduction in the volume of 152mm fire and a significant increase in the volume of 120mm mortar fire. Thus, whereas total ammunition expenditure in 2022 was approximately 12 million rounds, fluctuating between 20 and 60,000 rounds fired per day, Russian fires in 2023 are currently trending closer towards 7 million rounds if the current rate of fire is maintained for the remainder of the year," end quote. They added that Russian gun positions are for the most part no longer dug in, which provides a level of protection, but simply concealed. Then when a fire mission comes down, the howitzers move to a pre-planned firing point where the ammunition has already been supplied. At times, that same howitzer may complete their mission, then move to another pre-planned firing point, also already supplied with ammunition, to begin to engage additional targets. Now, the shoot and scoot idea here is a direct response to the counter-battery threat, be it from Ukrainian artillery or loitering munitions. And on the note of counter-battery, RUSI states that Russia is primarily conducting that mission with Lancet loitering munitions, which is an overall shift in this war and something we've seen Ukraine do as well. In pretty short order since this war began, counter-battery went from using a radar to fire at a point of origin, to getting a drone overhead to relay back coordinates, to just arming that drone and cutting the battery out of counter-battery altogether. Shifting over to engineers, this portion was mostly focused on Russian defense, so I'm going to tie in a little bit from other sections to kind of round it out. But RUSI says, quote, "In contrast to much of the Russian forces, its engineers have performed well, with 2 engineer companies assigned to each brigade, one focused on mining and the other on force protection," end quote. In terms of those defensive positions, RUSI says that most are made up of 2 to 3 lines, depending on the situation. The first, along the line of contact, is usually just infantry fighting positions and foxholes. Then the second is a little more substantial of a trench, supplemented with concrete fighting positions, anti-tank ditches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and wire. Now, this second line is usually around 5 kilometers behind the front, with a third position, sometimes even further behind that, for reserves and command posts. And RUSI added that in some areas, the defensive fortifications here exceed 30 kilometers in depth. Ukrainian forces also reported to RUSI that the minefields that accompany some of these Russian positions often follow no discernible pattern and are rarely marked. adding that it doesn't appear that Russia has any shortage of anti-tank or anti-personnel mines. Then wrapping up the engineer defensive line piece here, RUSI says, quote, "While Russia's defensive operations are positional, a cardinal sin among adherents of maneuver warfare, defeating the layers of prepared defenses still presents a problem. These defenses are not absolutely positional, with Russian forces utilizing some mobile reserves at the tactical level. The depth of the defenses means that Ukraine must generate serious combat power to penetrate the Russian lines, and the extent of Russian defensive fortifications across the front makes bypassing them nearly impossible." End quote. Electronic warfare is something that's not getting a lot of public attention in this war. It's playing a major role every day and has for quite a while now, but there's still a lot unknown about the details. However, RUSI in this report says that Russian electronic warfare is the major contributing factor to Ukraine's loss rate of 10,000 UAVs per month. That's a pretty crazy number, but keep in mind that includes everything from the big drones all the way down to the little off-the-shelf unsecured quadcopters that a squad-size element might be using for reconnaissance. That number also gives an idea as to the volume of drones being used in this war, which RUSI estimates to be between 25 and 50 drones overhead for every 10-kilometer stretch of the front at any given point. RUSI added another piece here about how Russia is using electronic warfare deception measures where they create a large number of fake UAVs to show up on Ukrainian detection systems. That's not clear if these fakes are real enough to trigger any sort of shoot-down attempt, or if it overwhelms the system, or if it's just something that confuses the operators. So hopefully, at some point, get a little more information on that front. Speaking of air defenses, RUSI says that Russia's short-range protection has become significantly more robust since last fall. Sounds like they've moved their SA-21s and SA-23s to defend point targets like logistical hubs and command nodes, while SA-15s and SA-22s have been connected to their fire control radars, which, as a whole, has led to a significant increase in interceptions. The big takeaway here, which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, is that Russian air defense is much more effective in a defensive posture when they can be properly connected than when they're on the move trying to cover advancing forces. Then when it comes to aviation, it's a bit of a mixed bag. RUSI states that the Russian Air Force is still reluctant to push into Ukrainian airspace, but at the same time, the greatest threat to Ukraine is if the Russian Air Force gains the freedom to operate over the front. So this is an important one. The article gets into the use of Russian aircraft to launch missiles into Ukraine, as well as the increase of the Fab 500 bombs with glide kits. If you think back to some of the larger missile attacks in Ukraine over the last few months, there's usually a ton of Tu-95 bombers taking off, and then each one only launches one, maybe two missiles, which is interesting because that's way below their capacity. So RUSI suggests that this is designed to increase the number of axes that these missiles could be coming from as an attempt to confuse Ukrainian air defense. They add that Shahed drones are being used to scout gaps in Ukrainian air defenses that are then designed to be exploited by the successive missile barrage. I thought that was interesting. I mean, on the one hand, you're not getting a ton of intel from a drone launch. Some, sure, but Shaheds are only going to be engaged by certain air defense platforms. Like a Patriot's not going after that. On the other hand, it is a pretty cheap way to possibly confuse the air defense systems and tire out the operators before a larger strike comes in. Now with the Fab 500, which is a 1,100-pound bomb that Russia has been strapping glide kits to. RUSI believes that what we're seeing so far is likely a campaign to refine that glide kit over time. Right now, these can be dropped from about 70 kilometers away from a target, and while they're much more accurate than a dumb bomb, they're still not great. So there's a thought that the current strikes are being used to adjust the kits and calculation tables to determine the optimal release point, which could lead to an increase in accuracy going forward. Lastly, we have command and control, or C2. RUSI notes that the Gimler strikes by Ukrainian forces in July of 2022 pushed most headquarters elements at least 120 kilometers behind the front lines, which, as you could expect, added a few challenges. Over time, however, many of these have moved back closer to the line of contact. Russia seems to have minimized the risk that Gimler's poses to their C2 elements by reducing their electronic signature, dispersing them over a larger area, and occupying underground reinforced structures. To me, this is sort of the big takeaway from the article. Russia can adapt, and does, but as RUSI notes, their ability to predict future problems seems to be a real challenge across the force. I mean, back to last summer, the Gimlers fired from the MLRS or HIMARS platform did cause a major disruption across all of their C2. But the HIMARS going to Ukraine wasn't a surprise. Russia had plenty of time to prepare for that. They just didn't. And I think that's probably what we can expect going forward with any new capability added to the fight. Right now, it might be the Storm Shadow cruise missile, could be ATACMS or F-16s down the road. It's likely they'll have an immediate impact, and then over a period of time, Russia will adapt to where the effects aren't nearly as strong going into the future. Overall, great assessment by RUSI. I think they laid out some really solid points and clearly put a lot of work into this product. Again, I'll link the article in the description below if you want to give the full thing a read yourself, but that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.